can you put your hand up? Now, I've just put the recording button on, so we will be recording this for those who aren't going to be attending in person. Who understands? Hands up or a yes. Who understands what advanced care planning is about? As I say, I don't mind if you want to speak it or if you want to talk it or sign it in the chat. I'm going to take it that means not many of you understand advanced care planning. So that's what I'm going to, we've got a somewhat. Yep. Would anyone else agree with the somewhat understanding?
And I had to say, it's nothing to be embarrassed about.
Oh, gosh, no, that's what we're here for. We're just trying to get a bit of an essence of that sort of influence the way things go. Specifics for how the end of life will be cared for. Somewhat. All right. So next, what about end of life in general? Does, who's got a good understanding of end of life? Or are we pretty much here to learn about it? Is that what we came here because we don't understand it?
I'd be really interested in what people's muddiest point is. What's the thing about supporting individuals living with disability or their families or as a service? What are some of the really muddy questions? What are the things that...
So just if you could right now, because we'll ask some, we're going to start a bit of an interview process. So if you could just hold on to your questions and we'll just start off now. Now I've tried to establish a bit of a benchmark on what you know and what you don't know. So we'll just leave it at that. But so now I want to ask Caroline to just tell us a little bit about herself, what she's doing and where she came from. I think it's really important part of where Caroline gained her information from, as opposed to simply just an academic gaining of that knowledge, or is there a real kind of experiential background to it. So Caroline, tell us a little bit about what you're doing right now, what your role is.
Yeah, so thank you very much for having me today. This is a topic that I'm very passionate and interested in, and it comes from the lived experience in a way of being a support worker, but also a human being. So I started currently an associate professor, and I'm program director for ageing and disability programs in the social sciences, not in health, interestingly, but in the social sciences by choice. So I'm interested in the social construction of ageing and disability and how we respond to it as a society, how we take voice and control. What does that actually mean? And how do we empower people living with disability and their families and ourselves as service agencies that support?
Okay, so your professor, associate professor, is it associate professor? Or are you a professor? Is it associate professor of Asian disability, or say it again?
I'm only an associate professor. I haven't made...
She's only an associate professor of aging and disability. So what better background could you have to be assisting with these things? So the next thing we've had a chat before, Caroline, and you told me a story about what got you interested in end of life and why. And would you mind walking us through that? What happened when you were a support worker, which I'm assuming was a long time ago, back before, but like me, we go back a long way. Tell us about that story, because that really captured my attention and also made me, also twigged the fact that I knew Caroline had some experience in this real lived experience. So walk us through that.
Strathmont Centre, which thank goodness no longer exists here in South Australia. It was an institute, so it was similar to Kew Cottages and some of the particularly innovative place. But the history of disability services and how we ended up in that space is another conversation.
I think we better just take the let's try taking your camera off, because I'm losing a bit of your voice, and I know we want to capture every bit of it.
All right, I'll turn my camera off. I apologise for bandwidth.
No, that's okay. We just want to be able to hear everything you say.
So I started my career as a support worker. I had previously, in my late 20s, I had previously been working for the YMCA with young people and people who were disadvantaged in community development. So I had no prior experience. I went to work at Strathmont Centre to look at lifestyle, activities. It was a pretty formidable, formative 9 months. I then ended up moving to services in the community, and I started going to university to study the Bachelor of Disability and Developmental Education at Flinders. So my primary degree is as a developmental educator, which most people know what it is, but around Australia it's still an emerging profession. So it's a 4-year degree, equivalent to, in status, if you want to use that terrible word, to psychologist, OT, physio, but it's a specialist in disability across the lifespan. When I went to work in the community as a support worker in a SIL, or a group home as we used to call them, with 4 individuals, one of the individuals, a young man, had very complex, as did all 4 people who lived there, very complex support needs, and his condition deteriorated. He became end of life. He was just not, his body was just going to give up from significant spastic quadriplegia and other issues. Now, it was discussed with us by his family, obviously, and the managers, about where would we like, I'll call him Simon, where would we like Simon to pass away? And everybody agreed, because we cared deeply for him. We had been supporting him 24/7, that we wanted him to have the option of passing away at home. Well,
and home was home,
a group home.
The home was the group home. Yeah,
it was a group home. So we shared his home with 3 other people. So there were 4 individuals in this home. And to be honest, it was not a great decision, because what happened then, his family obviously wanted to be there on a daily basis. They were a family of faith, so there were other people, members of the church, wanting to come in. And this man had a small bedroom, which obviously was full of lifters and hospital beds. There wasn't a great deal of room. Also, the impact on the other 3 people who, the thing is, there was 1 toilet, there was 1 bathroom. Nobody in the house ate solid food. They all had peg feeds. So the family were wanting tea and coffee and sandwiches, and for us to host the myriad of visitors that were coming in. But we had 3 other people to support. And that wasn't, it just became, and it became chaotic. And in the end, we were having to take the other 3 individuals out of the house for 10, 12 hours a day. They were exhausted. Their home wasn't their home. It was just not the right environment. And
so that's really interesting, Caroline, because we spend and I think these are the things that providers are going to be faced with, is we spend so much time, and there has been so much rhetoric and propaganda publicly, and to change language and start calling this your home. This is your home. And so there we are saying, on the one hand, this is your home, but we've got this complex situation. Like you just described, where when this occurs, and let's face it, it's going to occur for everybody. This isn't going to be a sometime thing, is it? One thing we can be sure of is we're born and we'll die.
Correct. And this is where, we'd had no concept. The reality was, these 4 individuals were all vulnerable, and their longevity was absolutely at, not going to be the typical Australian longevity, due to the complexity of their chronic conditions, the fact that they spent a lot of time in wheelchairs and what that does. But we had no knowledge as support workers about this. So all of a sudden you get you get a diagnosis from a doctor saying the end of life is near. What do you want to do? There'd been no previous discussions. And to this day, even after Simon passed, there weren't discussions with the other three at their annual, and this is
even
pre-NDIS.
after that. So even after that experience, the disability provider sector still didn't see a chance to start a conversation.
And they still don't. I speak to people all the time about this. I teach this all the time. I advocate for this all the time. And very few providers, because people don't know what they don't know. It's not because providers are bad or families are bad. We just don't know how to do it. And so the emphasis of my work and my research now is around how can we do this well? How can we make this planning to say, so there can be an open conversation every year when we're doing people's plans. And look, really, even as children with disabilities, we don't talk, people with disability are often excluded from funerals. Families don't think it's best if they're not there. They won't understand. So it's a bit like retirement when that was my focus. People living with disability often are excluded, and death and dying and the normal rhythm of life they're excluded from it.
So one question that comes to me, and if it comes to me, I'm sure it'll be of help to other people. In that situation that you had, the initial situation, years ago as a support worker when that occurred, and you were just everyone was doing their best to get that participant through their life, end of life. In the short term, what did you do to make that happen? And then looking back now, all these years later, what would you do differently in the short term? And then I want to talk about the long term later. But in the short term, you did this, and now with all the knowledge and experience that you have, what would you have done differently in that situation with everyone in that home? Same thing happened, but with your knowledge.
So what we did in the short term was we actually, in the end, ended up booking a holiday for the other three individuals, and we actually got them out the house. So the house was full of people very distressed and crying. It was terrible for the other three individuals. And the assumption that because they had severe and multiple disabilities that they weren't impacted is terrible, apart from the practicalities. We also personally provided, as a team of support workers, we all went home and cooked and baked and made sure there were scones and sandwiches and tea and coffee, etc. for the family. And while that was appreciated by the agency, and it was a government agency at that time, there was no provision for that, and that was a mistake. Now, in the end, Simon died. He did die at home. He had a peaceful death. He had the best death he was going to have with his family and friends around him. But basically, the other three people that lived in that home needed to move out for that time. So thank goodness, in a way, it was a short time, and we as staff managed to provide the other three. But they did come back. They came back every couple of days to visit him and do the typical things that you would do.
So that's how it happened. And now, given what you know, if you put Caroline today in that position,
So now, as an end-of-life doula, even though I'm a developmental educator and an academic, I'm also an end-of-life doula. Because of that experience and some subsequent experiences with other individuals with a disability, I've done some extra training and become an end-of-life doula. So,
and explain what that is to us before you embark on your fix.
So, an end-of-life doula is essentially a non-clinical, non-clinical support that walks the journey with people, that has knowledge about death, dying, grief, bereavement, funerals, rituals, legacy items. We have a whole lot of skills, and we do whatever's needed. So, for example, very recently, I was asked to support a family that had quite a young person who was passing. Now, the family had beautiful friends and community around them, but they were getting 27 lasagnas delivered to their door on a Sunday night. What I did in that case was I actually contacted every one of those 27 people and said, the family would love some support. Do you think you could do a chicken casserole and drop that off on a Tuesday? Or are you really into cooking, or is there any way you could come one day during the week and mop the floors? And so what I did was a bit of a roster of, I talked to the family about what exactly activities were needed to make their life, you know, some of it was walking the dog, mowing the lawn, you know, bringing in the washing, picking up children from school, the other siblings, and taking them to the beach for a bit of fun. So
or a bit of reprieve for the parent.
A bit of reprieve. So my job was whatever they wanted. Now, towards the end of this child's life, the family obviously wanted to spend time, wanted somebody with this young man, and his preference was his parents or myself. He didn't want a whole lot of other peripheral aunts and uncles and people. So I held vigil. So we made plans so that the family could spend time with the other children, and the parent and mum could go and have a haircut. And unfortunately, the passing was slow. And so I spent time just listening to music, just holding space with this young man. And he passed in my presence once everybody else had nicked off. And the parents were quite a bit upset at the time. And I said, look, it's not unusual.
They often say that people will pass
when everyone's
the person
gone,
they feel safest with as well.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah.
And that's right. Children in particular don't want to see their parents hurting. Yeah. So the parents were very comforted by the fact that he waited for them to go and for me to be there. And I said to him, I just sang to him and some, you know, some songs he liked, and we had a bit of a laugh at my attempt to sing Katy Perry. And he took his breath, and, you know, that was a great comfort to the family. So it's whatever's needed. Sometimes it's, if it's people with a disability, it's talking about really openly about what's going to happen to their body. And I do that in an easy read, easy, understandable way. Yeah. Sometimes it's talking to the individual and the family. So I had one individual recently who passed. He wanted to go home to the group home. And I had many conversations with him about why that wasn't possible. So
that brings me back to when it first happened, and that young person back then in that day where it happened originally, when you first got the diagnosis that was going to require, you know, that made end of life, inevitable coming on early. So now, let's just say, looking back with your eyes now, what would you have done that very minute you got that diagnosis?
I would have got together with everybody. I first would have spoken to the individual, if that's possible, with their supports around, be that the support workers, the parents or whatever, and just had a conversation about, what do you understand the situation to be? What do you understand is happening to you at this moment? Sometimes family initially don't want the person to know exactly what's happening to them, and so it's a conversation. So sometimes service deliverers agencies will bring me in to talk to everyone and explain to parents and try to help parents understand why that's not really helpful, and it can be more damaging and traumatic. But people need time. So I use my skills and my counselling skills and my DE skills to work with families and service providers, and if possible, the individual as to what they want. And so with, and I'll call him Brian, with Brian, I spent time with him alone, time with his aunt, and time with his support team separately and together. And I was able to explain to him that he shared a house with 3 other people as well, because group homes tend to be big congregate lumps. Well, that's another conversation about how I feel about those. Yeah. But I explained to him why that could possibly be limiting for him. Yeah. And his experience, and also how his housemates really care about him, and they might find that not having a rest. And he really cared about the people he lived with, and he agreed. He just wanted some choice. He said, what are my choices as to where I can pass? And so we went through the choices about how he felt about medication. You know, he was experiencing a lot of pain, and that, you know, he was in hospital when I met him, and that wasn't a very fun place, being in the palliative care ward of a hospital. And there were all sorts of issues around, you know, not being able to, having horrible coffee, and he loved coffee, and me wanting to bring him a decent coffee, but I wasn't allowed for him to drink out of a straw because the nurse said, oh, he can't have a straw, he might aspirate. And I said, what, and die? Yeah. And he nearly fell out of the bed laughing.
Yeah, yeah.
You know,
we keep far too much... we make choices that people can't handle things without actually checking with them first.
Correct. So he knew he was dying. He'd chosen his coffin. He knew exactly what he wanted. But so then the discussions were with his support team were around, where can this happen? We talked about hospice. We talked about hospital. We talked about nursing home, if it was, because we weren't quite sure, how long this process was going to take. And it was, in the end, what we came up with was a list of things that he wanted in the environment more than the place. So I asked him why he wanted to go home, and he talked about he wanted his bed. Okay, well, maybe we can move your bed, which is what we did, from home to somewhere else. He wanted his football posters. So in the end, it wasn't actually home that he wanted. He actually wanted his bedroom and the comfort of his things. So what I did was I arranged with the support team is that we recreated his bedroom in the nursing home.
Oh, that's really interesting. Okay, so
and he
having those conversations up front and finding out, where that person wants to be and what is important to them, but also taking into account all the other people that would have been in that group home at the same time that could have had negative experiences from somebody suffering in those last few weeks. So can you just let us know, tell us a bit about some of the suffering that impacted on the other participants. So let's say we've got a share accommodation, a SIL home, and we've got, let's say, 3 or 4 people in there, and one is going to be going through, those last stages of life. And what is going to be happening, and what was the responses, and what did you see of the people who were sharing that home?
Okay, so the first thing is just the physical environment of one bathroom, one toilet, and Simon having mum and dad and aunts and uncles and cousins and, members of the church, pastors and other people wanting to hold vigil. So there were sometimes 6 to 8 people in, a normal house-sized bedroom, along with a hospital bed, along with oxygen, along with lifters, along with all the other equipment that goes along with supporting someone with severe multiple disabilities. There was one lounge room. It was the middle of winter, so people spending time outside under the patio wasn't an option. So Simon was distressed. He had very laboured breathing, and so he sounded like this, and this is a trigger warning, like this.
Yeah.
24 hours a day. Yeah. Now, that was a new thing, and this is before even the death rattles. This is just the condition that he had. He had lungs full of fluid.
And how did that impact on everyone else in the house?
Oh, you could hear it from the lounge room with the TV up full blast. So then you had people trying to have showers and toileting and stuff when the house is full of other people. Now, how does one have a good fart and a big sloppy smelly poo comfortably when you've got a house full of visitors outside the door?
So in essence, their home became a
hospice,
a nursing home, hospice, etc. So there's that idea of having, you might, at this moment, if we were all to start from scratch and say, okay, we're aware of this, but I've just had this person diagnosed and I haven't had a chance to get all of my end of care processes and policies and training in place. So sometimes you might just have a case like that where you've just got that they're about to start passing. Yep. So you have to deal with that one. But let's just say in a perfect world where we're going to start implementing this. Tell us what conversations should happen just when this is diagnosis are happening, or should conversations happen much earlier in the process? And should they even happen when we have people coming in for their assessment and they come into our organisation? Tell us where the conversation should happen, Caroline.
I think the conversation needs to begin, from an educative process with children. It needs to be developmentally age appropriate. There are lots of beautiful stories and books. People with disability, as they grow up into teenage years and start to enter adulthood, when we start to include them in lifestyle plans, where do you want to work, where do you want to live, we need to talk about, you know, the circle of life. Where does that come into the conversation? Because it's not just about the person with a disability, it's about grandma or grandpa or auntie or neighbour or peer. You know, like for young men living with muscular dystrophy, they lose peers all of the time. So it's about teaching people about the circle of life and the fact that death will come to us all, and it can be very scary. But how do we educate people about what it is? So like some people I work with want to know about, so I think it's when clients come into our service as part of the planning for the future, we need to bring up the conversation about, have you ever talked about end of life issues? Have you ever talked about what you might like if you became really sick and your life was going to be shortened? Have you thought about how you would like, you know, with parents or guardians, how would you like how would you like your, because often when parents pass, it's siblings that then say, oh no, we don't want Simon to come to the funeral because sometimes, you know, families are not always cohesive, and sometimes individuals with disability haven't been very involved with extended family, and so they get excluded. And that just adds to the trauma and the mystique, because it must be something fearful. We should have these conversations as part of every year. Now, you can try and have a conversation with a family and with an individual, and they might say, no, we don't want to know about that. We don't want to think about it. Okay, that should be noted in the lifestyle plan under advanced care planning and, you know, the circle of life.
So that's what I was going to come to. So that when we had that plan, when that plan is going to be put in place, that's called advanced care planning and an advanced care directive. Am I right?
Yeah. So there's kind of a few elements to it. An advanced care plan tends to it's like how long's a bit of string, and as you know, the resources that you've presented, each state is slightly different. South Australia has one of the most comprehensive, and they're currently reviewing it. But basically, an advanced care plan can be very clinical, like in a hospital setting.
It doesn't have to be.
It doesn't have to be. So I've been in a hospital setting where a parent was given a scrap of paper and told to write, I don't want my son resuscitated, and sign it. Like that's a horrendous thing to do in a corridor of a hospital, right? So so an advanced care plan is a process. It's a planning process like any plan, like planning for employment, planning for accommodation, where you talk through, in this situation, what do you think you would like? Do you want to be an organ donor? Do you want to be resuscitated? Under what conditions do you not want to be resuscitated? What would you like for a funeral? What would you like to happen to your body? So, for example, if someone is Jewish, there are particular rituals around washing and preparing the body, and certain people that need to do it, and timeframes that, if possible, people would want adhered to. So it can be a very simple document and very clinical, but it also can be a beautiful document that highlights
talking about that sort of
stuff.
Ending life well, you know, instead of, you know, so going beyond that, you know, non-resuscitate, don't resuscitate me, this is the sort of funeral. There is more that can be in that, am I right? There can be, you know,
absolutely. So it can be how do I want to die? Do I, you know, who do I want there? Do I want music? Do I want singing? You know, for example, like Brian, when he died, he had a coffin that was so into cold chisel. We used to drive the nurses mad, because whenever I would go at mealtime to assist him with his meal, because nobody, you know, the hospital staff he wasn't eating anything, and they would come in and go, oh, how come you got him to eat everything off his tray? You know, well, you know, I got some skills, been there, done that for 35 years, you know, and playing cold chisel and dancing around the bed to encourage him to eat worked wonders. So his coffin was covered in Jimmy Barnes and cold chisel stickers, and you can actually get anything printed these days on a graphic that they stick on a coffin. Like, so his coffin was shrouded in and he had certain things he wanted. There were, you know, so he really planned his funeral and his wake to the end. He wanted a big party. He wanted at this particular pub. He wanted this food served. He didn't want this, he didn't want a miserable church service with everybody crying and wailing. He wanted balloons. He wanted all his friends with a disability to be invited.
Yeah.
So that was quite an elaborate plan. But we also talked about he didn't like pain, and he had bowel cancer that had spread to his liver and his lungs and eventually his brain. So he was in pain a lot of the time. So his advanced care plan talked about communication. So he didn't have a lot of verbal skills, but he had a thumbs up, thumbs down.
Yeah.
And he could look at visuals. So the advanced care plan also included a synopsis of how to communicate with him and how he could express his choices, which was really important for the nursing staff. Not that they were all using it, but I started using it in the hospital, and then the nurses went, oh, that's how you use that. So having stuff, if people communicate in a specific way, he didn't like his feet to be touched. So there was, so some of the preferences that people have, the things they like to eat and drink. For example, he hated instant coffee with an absolute passion. And yet every time I went there, he had crappy instant coffee. And that's how I bought him a cappuccino from the cafe on my way in. And when I wanted a straw, they said, no, he can't have one because he might aspirate. So in the end, I used a syringe. But because I was going to get that coffee down him no matter what.
Yeah.
So it was so an advanced care plan can, if you nut down, it can't be 48 pages, but sometimes some key highlights about someone's preference. So for example, my hair is really important to me. So if I got a diagnosis, whatever, I'd still want someone to make sure that I looked clean and my hair was brushed, and
those things are really important, because when we can no longer do for ourselves, that's right. So when we come to, we've got conversations about end of life first, and we've got end of life, we've got our planning, right? So when do you, in best practice, suggest that our providers here have the conversations with clients? When is the most appropriate time?
Yeah. As soon as, look, I think when you meet them and you induct them into and orientate them to your service, one of the things I would be introducing to families and individuals and guardians is here and my business name's Samsara, which is an interesting Hindu word for the circle of life.
Oh, there you go.
Here at Samsara Life Supports, or life services, we have information about advanced care planning. We have information about learning about end of life and choice and control. We have information that educates people about grief and bereavement and what happens when, family members or friends or others pass away. So I would actually have a brochure that people include in their orientation manual that tells people that this is an option, that we can make a time. So you might not, jump on it out the bat, but you sow the seed to say.
Absolutely. That's what I was going to say. There will be some people, Caroline, who are not going to want to have that conversation. No. So what would you do there?
What I would do there is say to them, we completely respect the fact that you're not ready to have this conversation, but it's really important to us that you understand that our organisation does provide support and services in that space. We can refer you to other supports and services. We can refer you to perhaps legal, if there are, it's almost about future proofing for some families.
Yeah.
So for some individuals, it's about future proofing around parents and guardians and family passing. And sometimes it's about the individual and educating them so they can manage grief and bereavement, and then also understand what's going to happen to their own body. So it's kind of three elements. So I would be providing some simple information, a one-pager or two-pager at onboarding to say this is what we like, and for us, if possible, in the first year, we would like to have a conversation. We would like to offer you the opportunity to have a conversation, and you do it, and then every year,
with the assessment after that.
Every year when there's a plan or a review, you go, hey, do you remember we gave you that information? And
Yeah.
would you like some more information? Would you
Yeah.
like to see an advanced care plan? Would you like to have a chat with us about what's involved? You know, so you're really sowing that seed. You're not forcing it on people, but you're putting it front and centre.
But we're putting it into the assessment indicator.
Correct.
I mean, this is
Correct.
part of assessment. We do it in hospitals.
Correct. Yeah.
Why are we not doing it here? Because the thing is that we know is, and I think I wrote, it's really difficult for a parent or even a child or the loved one to actually want to have that conversation. And I can remember my mother saying, I know you don't want me to talk about this, but I have to.
Yes,
And I
that's
felt,
right.
oh my God, this isn't about me. This is about her. And
Yes.
so we have to be that person. If
Yes.
we've got 24/7 care of someone, we have to be the bigger person. And we have
And
to
you know
have
what I
those
say to people?
conversations.
There's a fantastic guy called Stephen Jenkinson, Stephen Jenkinson. I think I put links to his stuff in my PowerPoint.
Excellent.
And he wrote, there's a fantastic documentary made by him called The Grief Walker. And Stephen talks about the fact that he's had a whole lot of roles. His stuff to read is a bit heavy and he can seem a little bit complex, but there's some basic premises to Stephen's, if I can indulge. He says,
I can actually open that PowerPoint too. Would you like me to?
Yeah. He says, Stephen says, he's got a phrase that I've used in almost every situation with someone. And the phrase is this: how we set the table as we die and as we pass, how we set the table determines how those who are left behind eat when we're gone.
That's nice.
So this is a learning opportunity for everyone.
Can you tell me if that's in front of you now or not?
Yes, it is. Thank you.
It is? Oh, good. Okay.
So I say to parents, in terms of your own passing, how we do this, how we involve your son or daughter with a disability in the planning, in the process, in the aftercare of you, how we do that, how we plan for that, how we set that table will determine how your son and daughter copes after. Now, they're going to miss you and they're going to grieve, but let me tell you, they're going to do a whole lot better if they've been involved all the way along than if they suddenly find out you've died.
Yeah, that's exactly
right.
And
if they don't get a chance to say goodbye. I've actually worked very recently with a woman who her mother died. She used to see her mother fortnightly. Her mother got dementia. This woman is aging herself now, lives with Down syndrome. She used to visit her mother every fortnight in the nursing home. Her mother died. She's estranged from her father and her brother, who want nothing to do with her. And when her mother died, she was told that there would be no funeral, there would be nothing. And despite my extensive research and writing to the public advocate and all sorts, public trustee and all sorts of things, we have not been able to find out what happened to her mother's body. Now, I was able to find out that her mother was cremated, but I have not been able to find out what happened to the ashes, because the funeral director knows but can't tell me, because of, this woman has now got dementia herself and can't ask. And the problem is that she went downhill. The trauma of not knowing what happened to her mother and not being included actually caused a major deterioration for her.
I think that raises some of the questions too around, let's say we did it, we were perfectly having those conversations, we were able to put end of care, end of life conversations, we're having end of life conversations, and we've got advanced care directives going in place. But in those situations where we don't, or we've already got situations at play already that are acting, that are playing out already in our care, what about the capacity? What's this? Let's throw the spanner in there about there's a time that we're primed to be able to make decisions, or people can make decisions on their behalf. And then there's some people who can't really at the moment anyway. So what's that icky part? What do providers need to know about capacity supported decision making.
Yep.
And let's say a person does not have the mental cognitive capacity to make decisions for themselves at this moment. What do they need to know?
Look, this is the icky part.
Yeah.
So this is where it gets complicated. So I'll start by preface what I'm saying by somebody's legal ability to give consent, and I'll explain why I'm saying this after, is not a reason to not engage in the planning process. So even though there is even though there's every possibility that there will be no legal standing in the documents you produce, there's a benefit to the individual of at least trying and being involved.
And how so? What's that benefit?
Well, sorry, I just need to. The second part of that is, at the moment, there is a lot of work being done and a lot of debate going on here in Australia about this issue. There's a lot of advocacy going on from Dr. Margaret Brown, myself, and others who are doing research into this issue and working with legislators and government around simply the fact that someone can't give legal. So at the moment, if you can't give legal consent, you have to have a substitute decision maker. That means that somebody else who may not have even discussed this with you or even raised it with you will make these decisions on your behalf.
And now, just so the providers know, who might those substitute decision makers be in their case?
Well, they're usually legal guardians. So whoever the legal guardian is, and these days that's often not the provider. That changed in the 1980s and 1990s, where providers used to be the legal guardian, and then it was reverted. So it's often parents, it could be siblings, it could be, so this is a problem, because what's happening is for many people with a disability, particularly those that are getting older, not so much perhaps for younger people with a disability now who remain connected with family throughout their lifespan, we still have a whole generation or two of people living with disability who were removed from their family, or who were told, whose families were told to institutionalise them and forget about them and go away and have more children. So now, over the last 20, 25 years, we've tried to reconnect some of those people with family, and that's been successful or unsuccessful. So a substitute decision maker from a legal perspective is whoever has guardianship. Could be the public, public guardian could be. And what happens is that some of the time that's fine, because that substitute decision maker is someone that spends, like in the case of Brian, his substitute decision maker was his aunt, and she was brilliant, and she spent lots of time with him, and she was the one that actually brought me in and said, because there were other members of the family that weren't the legal guardians, but they were poking their nose in and causing trouble. And so really part of my job was to keep the two warring parties apart, including at his funeral, some in one door and some out the other. So, but, but yeah, as a doula, we do all sorts of things. We do whatever it takes. So substitute decision makers. So it's really important we work with those substitute decision makers to show them that there are planning, in the same way that substitute decision makers make the ultimate decision about accommodation, they make the ultimate decision about money, they make the ultimate decision about end of life and stuff. But I think substitute decision, families don't know that there's an option. There's an option to plan for this, to educate, to understand and involve the person with a disability in a way that meets their capacity. That's right, that meets their capacity. So when you're asked to make a substitute decision, you can be comfortable. It's painful for some families and service providers to make substitute decisions because the end of life comes really quickly for some people, and it's traumatizing for them, because they say, I don't know what the person wants. We can avoid, so how we set the table determines how we all cope.
And if I can just say how we set the table, analogy, translation for me is when the person comes into your service, and then at every time you review their assessment after that, think of it as setting the table. Would that be right, Caroline? That's our opportunity to lay down the groundwork.
Correct.
And
Correct.
if we
and sometimes that's just providing more, continuing to provide information and give people choice if they're not ready.
Because they might come around. They might come around. Yeah.
They do. They always do. I've not as yet had anybody not come around.
Now,
you know,
the other thing is there's an elephant in the room, and I'm sure some providers are thinking this right now. So as a mental health first aid instructor, when I train, I have to get people comfortable with asking the S question. Are you thinking about taking your own life? So I help them practice that. Now, I think that this is, in a way, just as hard, if not harder. What about those providers and staff who are so uncomfortable and can't see them having that conversation? What advice would you give to them? What can they do to upskill?
You can contact an end-of-life doula like myself, Annetta Mallon in Tasmania. I mean, these days with technology, we don't have to be sitting next to you. No, we don't.
That's right.
Annetta Mallon, Dr. Annetta Mallon in Tasmania is also an academic. It's Mallon. I think her business is Gentle Dying. She is a specialist in the LGBTQI+ community, but she also has an online training course.
Yeah.
There's myself, who's probably more specialises in people with a disability. So how do we take the language that can be quite complicated and quite legal or quite formative, you know, quite medically jargonistic? How can I work with you to help make easy read or script conversations that make it easier? There are doulas all over Australia.
Can I send out your business details with the recording?
Sure.
Yes. Okay.
And I'm sure Annetta would be more than happy as well.
Yeah.
I'll send you her details. She's excellent. She and I collaborate quite a lot. But there is an end-of-life doula. If you Google end-of-life doulas, there is an end-of-life doula directory in Australia.
All right, I'll try and include that in the recording email as well.
Yeah, I'll try and find that.
But also, so that's for getting someone else to do it. But what about on an ongoing business, operational, everyday level? How can people, if they're really uncomfortable in having, everybody's got different thoughts and feelings about death. What can you say to people about, you know, how
then do some PD. Include the opportunity to explore end-of-life and advanced care planning for individuals with a disability. So I run a thing called a death cafe. A lot of doulas do them, and we get together in a really comfortable space. And we could do this. I've done this for disability service providers, where we get together over coffee and cake. Usually not at the organisation's office. We often do it in a local coffee shop, or the function room of a pub. And I allow people to ask whatever they want to ask. They can know, and really we just have an informal conversation about all of those things.
So a bit of you can't ask that in a reality situation.
Absolutely. So we can do it very informally, or I and other doulas would offer very formal PD. We could do it, we do training sessions on that document that you can see there, My Decisions, My Ways. That's the one. Am
I on the right page for you now? Just tell me when you want me to scroll on.
Yeah, that's fine. So, there would be someone like myself would do PD or, for organisations. And once again, I can, I don't have to be physically in the room, but that can be arranged too. But I can do things using technology. There are courses. There are online training courses like doula. So you might not want to work as an end-of-life doula, but the training that we do can be really helpful. There is a certificate 3, I think, run by Helen Callahan. I've looked at the topic.
I also saw End-of-Life Essentials. Do they have free training, or is that paid for training? End-of-Life Essentials were advertising.
Now, the End-of-Life Essentials, the End-of-Life Essentials is very good, but people have to remember it's a clinical thing. But the principles, but it's still worth doing because it's free, it's online, and they are starting. But they don't particularly like end-of-life doulas. They think we should be registered, and I'm open about that debate. I don't want to be registered because I don't want it to be clinical. The scope of
There's not
practice
enough
for a doula
clinicians to
is
go
we
around,
will do
Caroline.
whatever somebody needs.
That there's not enough to go
Correct,
around.
correct.
Look, we can barely get enough OTs, behaviour support practitioners, social workers.
Correct,
How do we
correct.
think we should be able to just make this sort of thing more restricted? I think if we build
It's
up
silly.
the capacity of people
Correct.
to be able to have those conversations.
And so, like, I think the choices are, I mean, you can obviously go to look for social work and look for social workers and psychologists that specialise in grief and loss. You can there are lawyers around that can assist with some of the legal side of it. If there are online training I do like that Essentials one. I've done it myself, and I've actually contributed to research that they do. So
even if it helps the providers to be able to have the conversation and skill their staff to have the conversation, because it's getting that first word out. Have you thought about an advanced care directive? Oh, what's that? Well, that's the dying thing. So if they can just get that out.
And that's right. So that essentials work tends to be more at the point of having diagnosis. So if I can just give you one more story, a gentleman in his 40s, lived with intellectual disability, lived in the community his whole life, was quite volunteered, worked, really active, really nice gentleman. I'd known him for most of since he was an adolescent. His sister's also a developmental educator, and we worked together at the Intellectual Disability Services Council back in the day.
Yeah.
And I got a phone call to say that Fred is really unwell and a lot of pain, and he's been taken to hospital, and the hospital think he might actually have terminal cancer. And so I said, well, okay, can I, keep me informed if I can do anything to assist him. Now, this gentleman hated doctors, absolutely hated them, refused to go. He was able to give consent, like he had legal consent. He had about 10 or 15 hours support a week, but he ran his own life, and he had a wonderful team of support workers as well as some natural supports, some family and friends, but he hated the doctor, hated it. Now, he passed 4 days later before I could do anything, and in hospice, he had a lovely, peaceful death. As a matter of fact, my understanding is that he lost consciousness very quickly and didn't actually even get the chance to understand himself. I was due to go and see him and talk to him about what he understood was happening to him, and he was in a coma, and he never got that. He never really understood what happened to him.
We just don't know.
Yeah, as a consequence, his family, friends, and support workers were a mess, right? A mess of guilt, and I was brought in at that point and I did some individual one-on-one work with them. And then at his funeral, it was just so terrible. Everyone was feeling so guilty because they didn't know that he had this cancer. And, so what I did at his funeral, at his wake, was we're at the pub, I had big bits of butcher's paper on the wall, and I gave everybody rainbow coloured pens, and I said, can you take the time to write on these bits of butcher's paper all the things you've done with Fred in the last 5 or 6 years, right? Because that's actually probably about how long he's had significant cancer. It was a slow burn.
Yeah.
And then what I said to them was, okay, Fred's actually had this cancer significantly, and he probably knew that he was unwell for the last 3 or 4 years. And we all know what he thought about doctors and hospitals, and he probably would have been very reluctant to have any treatment, and I suspect you would have all been very pushy about him having it for your own, because we cared and loved him and you wanted him to stay. So despite what he wanted. Now, here's a black pen. I want you to go around and cross off everything you wrote on those bits of butcher's paper that you think wouldn't have happened had you known that he was dying of cancer. And all the holidays, trips to the football, all the risk-taking, they crossed everything off.
Oh, my gosh.
And then they all looked at me and I said, well, isn't it a good thing that we didn't know?
Yeah.
Because he got the life he wanted, and he had a fantastic life full of holidays and activities and fishing and football and meals at the pub and complete control over his life until 3 days before he stopped breathing.
Yeah.
Isn't that what we all want? And we
Yeah.
would have all been bossy britches
Yeah.
and got together and probably not with bad intentions.
No, not for malice. No.
No.
Yeah.
And none of that stuff. He would have spent the last 2 or 3 years having horrible medical treatment that he didn't want, and the outcome would have been the same.
Yeah,
because one of the things I also say to people is having treatment, and I've had this conversation just yesterday with a family where somebody doesn't want any more treatment. And I said, and they're very upset that they don't want more treatment. And I said, I'm going to ask the question, will the treatment, and this is actually with a 3-year-old child. Okay.
Yep.
So trigger warning. This child's had all sorts of bone marrow, is the treatment, and so this child's not had a good quality of life really for the last year, probably. Yeah. And so the parent, and I said to them, is the treatment likely to prolong his life or prolong
just the suffering,
his death?
Mm.
And these days, doctors, I said, the doctors are offering you all of this stuff because that's what they do and that's what they know. And
it doesn't make it right.
They're not doing it to be malicious, but they're in a situation where ethically, with the Hippocratic Oath, I said, but one of the things we have to understand is you need to ask one of those really hard questions to the doctors about, is this prolonging the life of our son, or are we just prolonging the inevitable?
Yeah. Now,
I haven't heard back from them yet, but I suspect the doctors will say, look, it's your choice, blah, blah, blah. But I think the doctor's going to say, look, there's a good chance we're going to be in exactly the same position in 6 months. And then I said to them, then you need to make a decision about whether you go on a holiday, go to Disneyland, do whatever, and just enjoy the last 6 months.
Yeah, it's so interesting. And look, my middle daughter is a registered nurse, and she's in a neonatal intensive care unit. So it's only for Westmead, which is obviously the referral hospital. Only the sickest of the sickest. And the way they refer to the babies and children, when it comes to that point of, well, do we withdraw treatment? What do we recommend to the family? Do we withdraw treatment or not? This is your choice. They have a way of saying the baby or the child's condition is not compatible with life.
Yes.
And if we can look, sometimes we have to look and change our gaze just slightly to see something in a different light. So if suffering is the inevitable, then from something, then I have to ask, well, who are we supporting here? Are we doing this for the carer, the mother, the father, because they don't want somebody to pass? Or are we thinking of the person when we're charged with making that decision? And I also know from my early days in working in a nursing home, when I swapped from being a dental therapist to studying again. And what I understood was, it was really interesting that all of the stuff that we were doing in the nursing homes was more because of the family.
Absolutely.
There were a lot of things that the people we were caring and looking after for didn't need. They didn't need, but it was the carers whose guilt and sadness and grief were just oozing. And so a lot of what we do is just so that we're managing the grief of the carer. And so we have to help people to see, are you making these decisions for you so that you can extend someone's life so you feel better? Or, really think about it for the person.
I think we do. And I think organisations, in the same way that organisations consult with OTs and physios and psychologists, you need to find out who are where are the resources that you don't have to be all things to all people. This is an area that requires expertise. You can build your capacity through some really good ways. I think the other thing is,
and you can pick up the phone and consult.
That's right. And there's a whole lot of resources at the end of my PowerPoint, as well as a fantastic book called End of Life and People.
Shall I scroll?
It's right at the very end of the PowerPoint.
Okay.
After that, there's a whole lot.
Oh, yes, there we go. Okay. And so there's lots of resources here.
There are pages and pages of them. So
Yeah.
I think that's important. I know somebody had their hand up. Did they want to ask a question?
I think it's nearly question time. But before we go into an audience question time, can I ask one more question?
Yeah.
And I know this has happened, so I'm asking it from real experience here, trying to assist providers over the years. So a guardian has made all the decisions. They're the substitute decision maker.
Yep.
The provider can see that the person is very unhappy, but they can't make them budge. What do you do?
There's not a lot you can do but comfort the person to the best of your ability to do so and go along. It's just, you don't want to be playing tug of war at the end of life. You really don't. If somebody's, all you can do is do your absolute best. And sometimes it's just not going to be, it's just not going to be, you've got to think about, is the fight, I mean, you could go to the guardianship, you could get legal advice and whatever, but is that process, how long is that process going to take, and is the person going to be passed before it happens? It creates a whole lot of angst and ill feeling, and that sort of happened a bit with Brian, but my role was that's where social workers and others, for example, I knew when I worked in respite as a support worker, one gentleman had been in respite for 2 months. His father had passed away 6 weeks earlier. We worked so hard with the family, the siblings, to get him to be able to visit his dad in hospital. We weren't even allowed to tell him that his dad died, let alone go to the funeral. And really it just took us months and months, and nearly 3 months. And he knew the whole time. And eventually we took him and we had our own little funeral and stuff. But that was really cruel, and there was nothing we could do but support him. So it's not always going to be the ending and the outcome we want, but we can just do our best.
Okay, and one more question too before we go for questions. So first of all, just on support workers. So forget about the managers, what they need to know. I just want to focus your head on, what would you think is the most important things for a support worker to know? Not managers and not owners of the business, the support workers. What would you see as the most important skills for support workers to have in terms of end of life and respectfulness, in terms of trying to ensure that advanced care directives are followed?
I think, look, firstly, I think any work around end of life is going to challenge our personal point of view. So I think we need to reflect on, we think, feel, understand, and know about end of life. And what would we like to know? I think that, one of the reflections at the end of my PowerPoint is, if you could spend time with an end of life doula, what questions would you ask? What are the things that are least clear or most challenging to you about death and dying? And it is quite natural and quite, so I think for support workers, you're at the coalface. So I think it's about thinking yourself. That book, do some reading about end of life. Have a look at the Talking End of Life website, which is an Australian one, which was put together by the people who've written the book. And have a think about, what do you know? What do you understand? Do you know what active dying looks like? Most people don't know what active dying looks like. And, would you want to? What are the boundaries for you? Because I think it's okay. In the case of Simon, there were a couple of support workers that just didn't want to be involved at that point, and that was okay. They were transferred to another house, and there was a bit of a swap. So I think it's okay to be honest, but try and know what your boundaries are. Now, sometimes you don't know until you're in the situation, but I think be willing to have a look at the essentials end of life modules. Have a look at Talking End of Life. Have a read of the end of life book, and have a think about your own beliefs, your own faith, because sometimes you've got to put all of that aside. And it's not an easy time, but it can be. I've seen some absolutely beautiful passings and deaths. I've seen some gorgeous deaths, and Stephen Jenkinson talks about, in some of, and you can see some of his stuff on YouTube. And in Grief Walker, he says, I was the director of a palliative care unit, and over his time there, he saw 1,500 people die. And he says, what do you think people are most afraid of? And he said, and the audience said, pain. And he goes, but we managed people's pain, and yet I saw 1,500 people die in wretched agony. Pain, fear of pain is not actually the number one thing. We think it is, but it's not. It's the becoming irrelevant. It's being forgotten. It's, you know, the fact that this experience, and depends what you believe, this experience it's change. People are good. There's going to be change. When you die, there's change. And it's the fact that, you know, change can be unnerving, that is the issue. And so it's about managing people's feelings about change, so it's really arming yourself with that and knowing what the options are. So sometimes I do legacy items for people. So I get together with the person who's dying and we write, they say, oh, my niece is getting married next year. Well, then let's buy a gift and write a card that someone else can give to them. You know, it's all of that, you know, what can we teach people through the process of engaging with death in a way that, you know, sees it as the circle of life. That's what but support workers really need to think inside themselves as to what, in the same way that you might ask, well, what are my behaviour support skills? What am I teaching someone to tie their shoelace skills? What are my skills around end of life? What do I already have? What would I like to know? And what are my boundaries? What are my boundaries? Do I want to be there when my clients pass, or is that something I just don't think I can do? Now, you can always change your mind, but and as teams of support workers, and you should be talking about this. How
it should be part of supervision as well.
Correct.
If you've got people who are palliative, if you've got people, you know, end of life, etc., then yeah, it should form a part of the supervision.
You shouldn't have to do it on your own. I don't do it on my own. You know, I mean, as doulas, we get together and support each other. So Annetta was my supervisor. So, you know, and when I did my training, and we've maintained contact and we support each other. So I think it's that tapping in, knowing what the networks are around you and tapping into them.
Absolutely. I think I've exhausted my questions for you. So I think if we open up to see who's got any questions, please don't worry about writing it. If you don't want to, you can speak it. Who's got a question for Caroline? But do write it if that's more comfortable.
It's Tyler Eggleston here. Thank you both for the information provided so far. It's been really helpful and really insightful. So thank you both for that. I had a question that I did pre-submit. I
didn't get that. Sorry, Tyler.
Oh, you didn't get it?
No, sorry about that.
That's okay. I need to... Let me just have a look if I've got it, whilst I just have a look, just so I've got the exact question that I've got to ask. So
lovely.
If you don't have it, let me just have a quick look. So we had supported a gentleman through end of life process. And as a provider, we were very much advised by his speech therapist that he should be on a soft food and thickened fluids diet. However, he continued to risk feed when his family came over, because we were following the direction from the specialists. However, where there was, I guess, a conflicting situation is that our staff were expected to, because it was very likely, and his doctors had come around from from the hospital and said that you are at serious risk of bolus obstruction, and you're putting not only your family, your young family here, at risk of that, given the recommendations to change that diet. I know that's obviously choice and control, but also our staff would have been the ones expected to respond to that in the situation. So I guess in terms of that, because I know absolutely about choice and control, but also we do have a duty of care to our support workers as well. It just put us in a bit of a situation where we weren't sure how to necessarily respond to that to ensure the best for both sides. Do you have any, I guess, any
words of wisdom, Caroline?
Yeah.
Oh, Tyler, I feel for you. I had exactly this situation when I worked as an accommodation manager, and there was a young woman who came in. She used to come to respite and she would eat everything and anything. Anyway, she went into a large congregate care accommodation where there were like 2 staff and 20 people having dinner, and she choked once and was assessed, and we were told she had to go on a soft diet, and it wasn't even easy chew, it was a soft diet and thickened drinks, and she started throwing plates of food everywhere, and the behavior, she just didn't understand it. And when she went home we knew when she went home to her family, she would eat tacos and pizza. So it was a really difficult situation. Can I just ask, are you supporting this person in their own home, or are you supporting them in a SIL?
It was in a SIL. In one of our houses.
Yeah. Look, could the person give consent? Were they able to give legal consent?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I think in that situation, what you're faced with is that's where an advanced care directive or a plan is to say, okay, if this person's going to do that it's recorded in a planning process that this person has been given X, Y, and Z advice from X, Y, and Z practitioners and X, Y, and Z, advice, and they sign off that they've received that advice and education, but that they are actively choosing to continue to eat other foods and drink, and that there needs to be a plan in place. So what happens to the support workers? So what is the step? So if he has a blocked was it a peg feed that he had?
No, esophagus.
Unfortunately, this gentleman, bless him, was very, very reluctant to any support like that. And by the time it came that he, required that peg feeding, it was actually too late to have a peg. And he was unable to talk, and was at extreme risk of, because he was still having his family come over and supporting him to smoke heavily, which was also causing that irritation within the respiratory system. And that with his speech therapist, he was unable to cough. So then he was at that higher risk of also that the food was actually potentially going to cause an infection in his lungs. But that didn't matter to him. He still wanted foot-long Subways and KFC fried chicken. Because of all the reports and the assessments and the way that, the education that we had around, the same muscles that help you cough are the same ones to help you talk. So with that,
but you know what, Tyler, at the end of the day, it was his choice. We all on a daily basis do things that we shouldn't do. Okay. Sure. We all do it. We all eat a bit of chocolate. We know it's bad for us. People have 2 sugars in their coffee, but because we don't live in a fishbowl and nobody's looking at us, we can be deviant and nobody knows.
Sure.
What I think you need to do in that situation is have a plan in place to protect the staff in the organisation. That it is signed off in writing, even if it's got to be on a stat deck, signed by the individual or whoever the guardian is, the individual and a lawyer in front of a JP to say that he understands that this is the risk, and should there be choking, that there will be an ambulance called immediately.
And we definitely had all of that in place, maybe not to the level of that plan and the sign off
Yeah, that's what you need.
I'd
You need
definitely go with the sign off. It would be just
Yeah.
the
Yep.
same. Yeah.
What we arranged with this young woman was that we actually got a stat deck, and we got a stat deck signed by mum to say that mum, as the legal guardian and custodial of this woman, took responsibility
Dignity
for
at risk.
for
Yeah.
the choices she made. Now, we did put some education in place for mum around perhaps chopping the food up into, you know, bite-sized pieces and etc. And what we did in the institution was that the speech therapist refused to sign off on it, but
Yes.
staff were being injured by her throwing. She wasn't eating. She wasn't going to eat it. So,
and that's their right, isn't it, Caroline? They can choose not to, but it's not a perfect world. And
it's not.
we can't lock up people's brains and minds.
That's right. Can I just say though, and this is all pre-NDIS. So, but what we did do as accommodation manager, I managed to put an extra casual staff member into that accommodation facility at meal times. Breakfast wasn't a problem, but lunch and dinner were. And rather than eat in the dining room with 25 other people, we set up a dining table for her and 3 other people. So she still had the social event of eating with others, and a staff member that sat down with them as well. And they sort of had a nice meal at a dining table with a tablecloth, and which was more what she was used to when she was home with mum. Now, the speech pathologist was unhappy, but we did get sign off from the guardianship board and from the mother that's what we could do. Sometimes that's the best you can do. Yeah, you can't make someone do something. And as I said, at the end of the day, I had another case where a guy had diabetes, and he was really independent, used to walk down to the beachside here every day and hang out with people and eat cream buns. And the staff said, but he's got diabetes. And you know what? The doctor said in the end, he's 75 years old. Something else is going to kill him before the diabetes does. Let him eat cream buns.
We do
and he's walking. And the doctor said he walks, 5 kilometres each way to go and get the cream bun. So, sometimes, but you've got to cover yourself. So we had to document all of that and, get the guardian to sign off to say that we understood that there was a risk. And we talked about what education and advice had been given and, but in order to protect ourselves, that's what we did. Yeah.
That's a good one. I've got a question here from Theo. We've got a few minutes left. Theo, this is not really, this is more an NDIS kind of question. When can a provider inform the NDIS about the situation and possible change of circumstances? It's just like any other change of circumstance, Theo. This is not based on any theory around end of life or aged care directives. It is if the circumstances of care deteriorate or improve, we have a change of circumstance.
That's exactly right. So if in getting a palliative care or if in getting a terminal diagnosis, it's likely the person's going to decline and need more support, then that's a change of circumstance due to the fact they've had a diagnosis. So it's exactly the same. Yeah. So it's not until you've got the evidence, be that medical evidence or otherwise, and it may be that someone gets a diagnosis of terminal cancer. Now that or they could get a diagnosis of motor neurone disease or some other degenerative condition that could take quite a while for that person to require additional supports or less supports or whatever.
So it's the deterioration, isn't it?
That's right. So then it's at the time when you've got the evidence that there's a change of circumstance. Yeah.
Yeah. Have they got any other questions? We've got a couple of minutes. We've got 6 minutes.
Can I just ask people, do people like Tyler, do you feel like the team and support workers are interested in trying to understand more about this and bring this into an element of the service your organisation provides?
Absolutely. Okay. I think in terms of a lot of the demographic within our service, that it's something that we want to be better at and have a better approach at it, because it can be uncomfortable. And it, you know,
it's uncomfortable.
Yeah, and building that education for us as managers to be able to then pass that on to the people on the front line who are in there working with our wonderful participants every day to have a better toolkit as to how to manage that and how to go about that and make it more of a not as taboo sort of conversation.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Definitely
and
having those conversations over and over again will help.
Right. And I think I go back to my Stephen Jenkinson statement, how you set the table determines how you cope with this. So if you decide to set the table at the last minute and use paper plates and plastic knives and forks, that's the quality of what you're going to get. And the meal may not taste so good, and it might be a bit traumatic when it all falls all over the floor and turns into a shit show. Excuse my language.
Yeah.
You know, whereas if you plan your meal and you set the table nicely and you have, you know, you have a tablecloth and you have everything organised and set out, there's a better chance. You still might drop the spaghetti on the floor, but there's less chance.
So it's a few minutes of discomfort for something that someone or some people may be eternally grateful to you for, just like the suicide question. It's a few minutes of discomfort for somebody's might save a life or at least get someone into recovery. So it's about tolerating that.
It is, and it's about, you know, not launching, and I think, you know, we've made that point, and, you know, not having to launch into, you know, circle of life stuff and end of life stuff and advanced care planning on induction, but slipping some information in there and simply letting families and individuals know that this is a service that we offer, and where we, you know, if not before, anytime you can raise this with us, and we'd be happy to start a conversation. And then if you don't hear anything when it comes up to the first review or whatever review you're doing, you might say, hey, did you have a chance to have a look at that information? Would you like to talk about it? Would you like to make a time to talk about it?
And as you know, there are ways to do things, aren't there, Caroline? Like if we go, okie dokie, let's talk about ending. They're not going to really warm to that. So it is about the way that you sort of bring it into the conversation.
Yeah, so, and you provide information that people can take away that go, you know what, because a lot of, unfortunately for some people, you know, parents haven't thought about it, and it might trigger in them,
it hurts.
You know, and because the other thing is about future proofing. And I noticed there's a webinar coming up that someone's doing here in South Australia around future proofing for parents. So, you know, they kind of go a little bit hand in hand. The problem with end of life is it often raises questions for ourselves around, oh my goodness, I haven't got my will in order, you know?
That's it. It does. You've only got to have a parent pass away or a sibling pass away, and your will's in place soon after, within 2 months. And, you know, if we can be that catalyst for that situation in a lot less traumatic way, and just make these conversations part of everyday life.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Am I able just to add, sorry, it's just Tyler again, just off the back end of what I had originally said, and I guess just to talk to about providing more information to our staff. In the situation that we were in with the gentleman, we absolutely understood that he had very limited things, you know, in his control that made him happy, and eating all of those, you know, those foods and smoking and everything like that. We completely understood that they were the last things that could bring him joy, and definitely wanted to do that, and understood that the speech therapist wouldn't sign off on those plans that was happening. And then the dilemma is about then, I guess, requesting our staff, I guess, listen to and work with his choice and control around that, but knowing that they were potentially going to have to respond to him choking. So I think it's
not just the choice and control, it's dignity of risk.
Yes.
So it really is. And so people are going to make choices to do things that ultimately are going to take their life. And then it's our thresholds. What is our company's threshold of risk? Who are the staff?
Right.
Who are the staff who will be traumatized by that, and who are the ones that will embrace it?
That's right. And I think it's about getting that sign off, Tyler, and having a plan for when he does choke and making it clear to him. The staff are not going to do they'll do basic first aid, but they're going to call an ambulance.
Yeah.
Because we know it's reasonable to predict, if you want to look at duty of care, reasonable to predict that if he chokes, it's going to be fairly serious, right?
Yep.
So therefore, if you know in advance, if it's reasonably foreseeable that a choking incident for this gentleman is going to be pretty serious, then it's reasonable just to go straight to calling an ambulance. We're not going to, and in the meantime, we'll provide first aid to the best of our ability, but but it's that's all we can do. Whereas normally, if someone choked, you might try a number of things first, but in his case, straight to an ambulance because it's foreseeable that
there's a lot of risk. There's a lot of risk with him with his tissue collapse.
Correct.
And so the last thing, we'll have to finish up, but the last thing I want to say is, now from a quality auditor perspective, if I were to see things like this, I would be calling that best practice, and that's what we want, isn't it?
Yeah,
I was such
absolutely.
a competitive service operator. I wanted to be the best. So this is really, it shouldn't be innovative stuff, but it is at the moment, given the framework we've got at the moment with quality standards. This would be, really great practice. Let's get in there and do it. Yes. Have I fallen off? Is everyone there?
Yep.
Oh, good. Well, I want to say a big thank you to Associate Professor Caroline Ellison for giving us her time today, and to thank all of you for coming along, and those of you who are going to be watching this by recording as well.
Can I just make one last comment, if I could, to Theo's question about the family wanting someone in hospital and the NDIS not funding it? The way I've managed that, Theo, in the past is, as part of the advanced care planning, as part of what we want, is informing parents beforehand that the NDIS are going to be reluctant to do this, right? Because there's nothing worse than getting to the hospital and parents being very distressed because someone hasn't stayed with them, all right? So it's about preparation for families. If families then want someone with their loved one, we might have to have a roster of family and friends that come in and do some of that stuff, so it's about preparing families for the reality that the NDIS may not fund that. And in the case of Brian, they wouldn't fund it. Now, and so I organised a roster. Because the family were warring, so we did organise a roster of people to come in, so we all didn't visit at once. Now, I came in at meal times when I could because I seemed to be able to get him to eat properly. But, do you know what I mean? Like, it's, Theo, there's no... we need to prepare parents. That's why these conversations are very, very important. Even if someone we know, even if it's not about end of life, is the reality of parents understanding that when their son or daughter comes into supported living, that if they're in another system, like the health system or whatever, the NDIS, there may not be money in the plan to pay for staff to be with them. You may have to put in a change of circumstances or whatever, but it may be at that point that family and friends, if that's what the family wants, family and friends will need to assist with that. Whether we agree or disagree, that's just the reality.
Yeah.
So I hope that answers your question, Theo.
Okay, guys, I'm going to send all of those out to you. Thanks for such
and contact me, reach out to me. I don't have a website for Samsara because I'm too busy doing stuff to do it. But
I'll have Caroline's and her business's contact details there for you if you wanted to speak with her, and all the resources that we've spoken about. And yes, thanks, Caroline. Thank you so much.
No worries. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Bye, everyone. Caroline, I'll you send me the details that you want me to give out.
Yeah, I will. Gina, I have to fly because I've got another meeting.
Here. Yeah, same here. So thank you, Caroline. I'll talk to you soon.
All right. Thanks, Gina. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.